Can anybody name that song that was just playing? Do we have any Austin music? Stevie Ray Vaughan, what's the name of the song? It's Walking the Tightrope. And so that's the title of my book, is The CEO Tightrope. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I was a founder of a company here in Austin called NetQOS that raised about $13 million in equity and exited for about $200 million in 2009. And then I bought the assets of a company called Cash IQ, and we took that from zero to a $100 million exit. And that was enough to make me Chairman Emeritus of the Austin Tech Council, which I'm not sure what that means, but if anybody can tell me, that'd be great. And then now I'm founder and CEO of a company called Chorus that provides software for CEOs. So that's a little about me. Let me find out a little about the audience. How many Austin people do we have? Oh, we've got a few Austin people. Okay. For the rest of you, this is the first nice weather day we've had in 2 months. So if you're thinking of moving here, stop it. Okay. We don't need any more people here. If you didn't see the Jon Stewart video of the immigration crisis we have in Austin, you should look that up on YouTube. So what we're going to talk about today is the role of the CEO, particularly as it pertains to founders that start companies. How many founders do we have in the room? Everybody, okay. Everybody's starting a company, okay? How many people actually call themselves CEOs? Okay, and then the rest of you think you're going to be CEO one day, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So there are kind of three key attributes of the job, three key things that we want to focus on. The job of the CEO really comes down to being in command. And I was in the United States military, and so when you talk to a military person, a very senior person, you say, what does command really mean? They'll tell you it doesn't mean the ability to give orders. They'll tell you what it really means is responsibility. Okay, and if you hadn't read Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, he really does a great job in that book of talking about the responsibility that a CEO bears for all the jobs that are under your command. And so that's a task that a lot of people, until you've been in that role, they don't really appreciate. It's very easy to be the number two guy, but when you're forced to make decisions, really things get a little bit different. And so I learned this one of my first days in the United States military. I was at Officer Indoctrination School, where they train the doctors, nurses particularly, and nuclear power school instructors, of which I was one. And so they would divide you up into platoons, and each day a different person was put in charge of the platoon. And so the first few days we were there, they had some doctor or nurse in charge, and we'd go around and we'd have to complete tasks, and they'd have to make a bunch of decisions. And I was always surprised at how much they struggled to actually make a decision. They really were struggling, and I'm sitting there thinking, what's your problem? Here's what we ought to do. We ought to do this, we ought to do that, we ought to do so and so. And then about the fourth day, they put me in charge. And the first time it came to make a decision, I had about 10 people, all with a different opinion, telling me what I should do, and I locked up. And I just froze. And I went, wait a minute, this command thing is different, okay? And so that was the start of my trek to being a CEO. So command's a very interesting thing, and it does strange things to people, and that responsibility is a burden that every CEO has to bear. Second piece of the job is management. And I define management as making decisions about everything you have control over. So management is making decisions about who you hire, how much you pay them, what job responsibilities you give them, what title you give them, where they sit in the office, and a whole bunch of myriad of other things. Management is often perceived as the stepchild of leadership, that like management's kind of leadership junior. In my view of the world, management's the most important thing a CEO does. If you do a great job of management, you hire the right people, you put them in the right jobs, you give them the right resources from a capital and human resource perspective, then you don't really have to be that good at leadership, because good people will be able to do great things if you put them in the right position. Then the third part, of course, is leadership. And leadership gets a lot of ink, and nobody knows what it is, okay? Because I spent the first 20 years of my career trying to figure out what this amorphous thing called leadership really was. and trying to come up with some way, most importantly, to explain it to other people who worked for me. And so finally, after 20 years of working at it, I think I have a definition, and we're going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. So again, management is this power that is granted to you because of your position in the organization. One of the problems with management is that it can be both a positive force or a negative force. And one of the challenges you have as CEO is when a manager becomes a negative force in an organization, you have to act very quickly. Typically, an individual contributor, unless they steal from you, the worst they can do is do nothing, right? Just not contribute to the overall mission. But a manager, if they do negative things, and y'all probably all have horror stories of managers you've worked for or seen in organizations, they can cause everything to come unglued. So it's critical that managers are making a positive impression in your organizations and not a negative impression. So now let's talk about leadership and try to come up with something that's a little less amorphous than the typical descriptions. So management is power granted by your position. Leadership is power granted to you freely, of people's own free will, because of their perception of you. And particularly 3 characteristics we're going to talk about of their perception of you, of those 3 characteristics. Those 3 characteristics are credibility, competence, and caring. So let's talk about those 3 just a moment here. So credibility. Credibility is the idea that you believe what I say, I believe to be true. It doesn't have to be true, okay? All of us believe things to be true that may not be true, but the follower must believe that the leader is being totally honest with the person, right? Now, it really goes beyond honesty, though. There's the Boy Scout, or courtroom definition of honesty. If somebody asks me a question, I'm not going to tell them a lie. But for a real leader, there's a higher bar that has to be met. A leader has to be authentic. A leader has to be transparent. The difference is, to be a good leader, people must believe not only what you tell them you believe to be true, but you will also tell them everything they need to know, a much higher standard. So I often teach leadership to executives, and I say, it's one thing not to tell a lie, but it's another thing to be authentic and transparent, which means you're sitting in a meeting, maybe the CEO's in the same meeting, maybe a bunch of other of your peer executives are in that meeting. CEO presents an idea. You think it's the stupidest idea you've ever heard. One executive after another begins to tell the CEO what a brilliant CEO he is, as often happens. And then it comes your turn. Okay? What do you say? Do you say, hey, boss, that's a great idea. You went like this. You remember that commercial? Okay. Or do you say, boss, I don't get it. I think that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. Now, you can be authentic without being mean or cruel. I often preach to executives, you want to be as authentic as you can possibly be. Okay, you want to be authentic, but while being as nice as you can be. Okay? So instead of calling somebody's baby ugly, you may point out that they're not as pretty as the other babies in the room. Or whatever the case may be. Okay? But unless you establish that credibility with people, unless you establish that credibility with people, they won't follow you. Okay, the second concept is competence. People only follow people they believe are competent. Now, competence is a lot lower standard than credibility. Okay? You don't have to be perfect. How many times can somebody lie to you and you'll let them get away with it? Maybe once, right? Maybe they can recover from 1 lie. 2 lies, they'll never recover. Okay? Competence, we don't expect our leaders to be perfect. We don't expect our leaders to get every decision right, but we expect them to have a reasonable, rational plan. As I often see with founders, when they present a plan, they're looking for funding, they're talking to their board, whatever. I often see plans that in my mind are not, competent, don't show a competent understanding of the world. Anyone know how long it took Microsoft to get to 50 million in revenue? Guess? 50 million? 15 years? No. Okay. 5? You would think it wouldn't have taken them very long. I mean, Microsoft was one of the most successful companies in the world, right? Matter of fact, I talked to Steve Ballmer. I presented after Steve Ballmer at a conference, and they had a Q&A. I said, Steve, at Microsoft, did you ever have a situation where you worried about not making payroll? He thought a minute, and he went, no, never did. Okay? So an incredibly successful software company took them 8 years to get to 50 million in revenue. Okay, how many of you have business plans that show you getting to 100 million in revenue in 3 years or something? Okay, anybody willing to admit that? Okay, maybe you are. And if you can convince followers that that's a rational plan, then God bless you. But some of us are probably going to look at that and go, maybe he's not quite as competent as we thought he was. Okay, and then finally the third piece is caring. People have to believe you care. And I give this presentation a lot to technology startups, and I say, I don't really care whether you care. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm not telling you have to care. I'm telling you your followers have to believe you care. And people say, oh, you're just being funny, that's semantics. I'm saying no, okay? You can be the most caring person in the world. You can be Mother Teresa incarnate, but if you sit in your office all day, you never interact with people, you sit at your computer, you program, you whatever, they never have any interaction with you, how the heck would they know you care? Okay? And so all of these characteristics are critical how the follower perceives them in you, not how you are. Okay? Because you can be the most honest, competent, and caring person, but if nobody perceives that because you're an antisocial person, you never talk to anybody, you never do the things necessary to show these characteristics, nobody's going to follow you. Okay? So it's very important to understand that this is in the follower's perception, not necessarily in your own reality. So the CEO job. Why is it so different? I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot in the book and with people across all spectrums of life is it's one of those jobs to me that if you hadn't sat in the chair, it's really hard to understand why it's so different. Okay, most people think it's just the next step in a typical business career. But in my experience, it's not. It's a different step. It's kind of like you've been playing basketball all your career and you're the greatest athlete in the world, a guy by the name of Michael Jordan, and then you say, okay, I'm going to go play baseball. And you go from being the best basketball player anybody's ever seen to being a very mediocre baseball player, right? Now, if Michael Jordan had started his career at age 6 and only played baseball for 26 years, he probably would have been a pretty good baseball player. But he didn't. And that's the challenge with CEO. Most people start out in some functional area and don't get a chance to master the job until they actually have to do it for the first time. So some of the things that make it different. One, you don't get honest feedback. Once you get to any size in a company as CEO, you always are curious about the motives of the person talking to you. And it doesn't even matter whether it's employees, vendors, board members. It's very hard to be sure that you're getting honest feedback because everything's going to be put in their perspective, right? And they have a reason to engage with you, and so they're going to have, they may even think they're being honest, but it comes from a certain perspective. Second thing that makes the CEO job really weird for most people is, in typical fashion, let's say you start off as a sales guy or a technical guy, and then you get to be a technical manager, and then you get to be a director, and then you get to be a VP, and every time somebody brings a problem to your desk, you are typically the expert in the room. You may have not seen that exact problem before, but you've seen a lot of similar problems. And you've had more experience than everybody that's working for you. And so you have an idea how to attack that problem. And how do you attack problems when you're an expert? Well, you gather data, you do analysis because you understand all the data, and you come up with your best expert judgment. And then one day somebody knocks on your office and says, hey, Joe, we think you'd be a great CEO. And suddenly 9 out of the 10 problems that come to your desk have nothing to do with your area of expertise. So your whole way of looking at decisions, I gather information, I analyze data, All those things don't do you any good anymore because you don't understand the data you're looking at. Because somebody's asking you about a legal problem or somebody's asking you about a leasing a building problem and you're a developer. Okay? And so it's very hard. You have to learn a totally new skill for most people about how do you make decisions when you're not the expert in the room. You have no clear peers in the organization, right? Okay, everyone's in a different relation to you. There's nobody to go visit with and commiserate with the challenges you face in the job. You have total responsibility. If the company succeeds, you get huge rewards, everybody loves you, you're great. If the company fails, what happens? You're like the head football coach who goes 1-13. Nobody wants to hire the head football coach who went 1-13, right? You don't rarely often even get another chance unless you do it yourself. And then finally, you have to act through people. Most people get places in their career because they're really good at something, and they're used to doing a lot of things themselves. And the better they can do things themselves, the more rewards they've gotten. They were really good in school, they got good grades, they worked hard, whatever. And then suddenly you get in this CEO role, and to have any real influence at all, you've got to do things through other people. And that's a change for a lot of people and a lot of early stage founders. So we're going to talk about how to fix those things. But first, let's talk about the various stages of a company. And I divide it into 5 stages here. The first stage is the lay the egg stage. Okay, this usually involves some amount of alcoholic beverages consumed. This is 2 or 3 or 4 people sitting around in a room. We're coming up with the great idea, right? And suddenly someone has the aha moment, and we have the next great idea that's going to turn into the next Google or Facebook or whatever, and everything's great. And we go run around, and we do a bunch of stuff, and we're doing everything. We're wearing every hat. We're coding. We're selling. We may not even be selling. We may not even product yet. We're coding, though. And the world's our oyster at this point. And then if we have a little bit of success, maybe we raise a little bit of money or we convince mom or dad to give us their credit card or however we get our funding going, we have this project in front of us, right, to build the MVP, the minimum viable product, and really we're acting as a project manager. Our whole goal is just get that thing shipped and get a customer, right? And then at some point, if we're really lucky, though, we start creating a real business. And a real business to me is where you have funding, you have customers, you have employees, you have shareholders, you got all these people, okay? And somewhere around at this point, there's a transition that has to occur. And you have to start taking off every hat that you wore, developer hat, the sales hat, the finance hat, every hat, and giving those to somebody else. And that's a transition that a lot of founders really struggle to make. And I think one of the reasons they struggle to make it is because they don't know what to do if they give up all of those hats. And so that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about is what is the real job of the CEO? Because I think a lot of people say, okay, I know how to do development, okay, or I know how to do sales, but if I don't do that anymore, what am I supposed to go do? I mean, what the heck does a CEO actually do? Okay. Yeah, people are laughing because, people are not real sure what a CEO does. I mean, every other job's got a real nice job description. You know, a sales guy, he sells stuff, right? Marketing person, they market stuff. Okay, a developer, they build stuff. What does the CEO do? We're not sure. Okay, we're going to try to discuss that. And then eventually, if you have a little bit of success, now it's all about growth. Can we scale the company? Can we be big? Can we raise money at a higher valuation, so on and so forth, until at some point, somebody wants their money back, okay? They always do, okay? Investors always want their money back at some point. And actually, they don't just want their money back, they want more than their money back. They want a big return, right? And so that, through one way or another, ends up with some return to shareholders. First 2 stages, I don't consider that a real CEO job. Okay, you're talking about this, you're laying the egg, you're doing project manager work. Where the real CEO job starts is that 3rd stage where you get employees, customers, shareholders, critics, you get the whole 9 yards. And that's where we're going to talk about what's involved in that job. So here are what I've identified as the 5 things that a CEO ought to go do before he does anything else. The first one is a concept called own the vision. And this might be akin to, it includes the strategy piece of a business, okay? What it is we're actually going to go do, but it's bigger than that, okay? I like this word, own the vision. CEO doesn't have to create that vision. That vision could have been created. In my case, my first company, NetQOS, my wife is a 4.0 PhD from the University of Texas in electrical engineering, had a brilliant idea on how to do network management, a next generation network management product. I could understand some of it, and over time developed enough to own the vision of what we were going to do. I didn't create it, but I could go tell the story. And how you know when you own the vision is when you can tell the story of your company to the most technical employee that starts work for you and to your 15-year-old son. Okay? When you can go between those two groups and tell a story that really means something and captures what you do between those two ends of the spectrum, that's when you know you own the vision, okay? And that's the first thing that every CEO has to have. They have to have a clear vision of where their company is going. And so you spend a lot of time telling the story and practicing the story and talking to different groups. Every group you talk to, you got a little bit different pitch. Investors, you're pitching one way. New employees, you're pitching a different way. Customers, you're pitching a third way. But it's all within this concept of a story and vision for the company. Second thing you got to do if you're a good CEO is provide the proper resources. And typically when people think in terms of resources, they think in terms of money and people. There is no more important job than providing the right human capital to a company. If you provide the right human capital to a company, you can do poorly at some of the other things and still be incredibly successful, okay? I always wanted to be the coach of the U.S. Olympic basketball team when there was Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and Karl Malone and Charles Barkley and Scottie Pippen, and because all you had to do at that point, you had the right people, you just roll the ball out and go get them, guys. And if that doesn't work, then you rolled 5 more guys. You brought in Bird and whoever else behind them, right? And so if you have the right resources, everything else gets a heck of a lot easier. So I'm a big fan of CEOs spending a lot of time providing the human resources, being the chief recruiting officer for their companies. I once did 252 interviews in 1 year to hire 100 people. People would say, how do you have time to do that? I'd say, that's the most important thing I do. Okay? Because if I get that right, if I get the right 100 people, the rest of the job's pretty easy. Okay? If I get the wrong 100 people, I probably can't succeed no matter what else I do. On the capital side, hopefully you're going to generate most of your own capital. Now, unless you're in Silicon Valley where you can raise $100 million or $1 billion or whatever crazy new number I read every day, in most organizations you can't do that. And so while you may raise amount of capital to start, you're going to have to generate internally the majority of the capital you spend. In the history of NetQOS, we generated about $150 million in capital through selling things. We raised about $13 million in capital. Okay? If you have a successful business, you should be generating a lot of your own capital. There are other things that the CEO can provide that really only the CEO can provide. Another thing that people don't think about is kind of outside expertise. Often only the CEO can bring in expertise from other sources outside the company and establish them as an expert and tell the company, basically, we need to listen to this guy because he's an expert. Okay? I often use vendors to bring in outside expertise. Okay? I meet a lot of CEOs who never have time to meet with a vendor because they think they already know everything. What I've found is exactly the opposite. Vendors are the ones that are making progress in a particular area. The reason they're a new hot vendor is because they're doing something unique in a particular area, and they know far more about that area than I can possibly know. So I often use vendors to get educated on various parts of the business and use them as the experts in the room, whether I do business with them or not. Third thing the CEO has to do is build the culture. You are mom and you are dad, okay? The culture is however you are as the CEO. So there's some popular stuff about, you get around the table and you get everybody in the company and we kind of vote on what the culture is going to be and no. Okay, because the culture is not what people want the culture to be. The culture is what people observe every day from your actions as CEO. What behaviors you reward, what behaviors you punish, okay? It's no different. I don't have a big conference at my house to explain my culture to my kids Because if one of them does something wrong, I slap them upside the head, right? And they pretty quickly realize I could be saying one thing's the culture, but whatever I slap them upside the head when they do, that is the culture of my family, right? Okay? And so what a lot of CEOs don't get is this requires a process of self-awareness to understand how you are, not how you want to be, but how you are, and to explain to the company how you are. Now, you may use other people who know you well, people who've worked with you a lot, to help you explain that. Often they can say, hey, Joel, you're really like this. You may think you're X, but you're really kind of like this. And you need to tell people that. And so to me, when you talk about explaining the culture, and it really happens as you make this transition in stages of the company, if everybody's in one room, you don't have to talk about the culture. Same reason I don't have to talk about the culture with my kids. But when you get to 25, 30 people, 50 people, they're all not sitting in the same room, they can't observe you every day, then you have to explain the culture. Every new employee that comes in, you got to be able to tell them, here's how I am, here's the behaviors I'm going to reward, here's the behaviors I'm going to punish, here's how to be successful in my operation. And if you do that very well, you build a very strong culture. And if you have a very strong culture, you have huge advantages over companies where the culture is very weak and people come in and they don't know what they need to do to be successful, okay? They don't know. There's no right culture, okay? I can name 10 different successful companies that have wildly different cultures, but there is going to be a culture in your business, and the better you are at identifying it and teaching people about it, the more successful you'll be. And that's a role that only the CEO can do. Fourth step, you got to make good decisions. At the end of the day, decisions are just the fuel of a company. They're what make the engine turn. And the faster you make decisions, typically, the better off you're going to be. And this is not just about you making decisions. This is also, as the company grows, about you teaching others in your company how to make good decisions. Okay? When I was running NetQoS and things were going really well, I didn't have to make a lot of decisions because my executives knew what decisions they were empowered to make. Their managers knew what decisions they were empowered to make. And so the only decisions I had to make was where there was a conflict between two different groups of the organization. And I told people, if you're ever in a situation where you're in conflict with another group of the organization and I'm the guy at the top, then get that decision to me as soon as possible. That is my job, to make those decisions. But if it's in your area of responsibility, then I'm happy to give you my opinion, but your job's to make that decision in your area of responsibility. And so being very clear with people about what decisions are their decisions, what decisions are your decisions, how to make good decisions, and particularly when you make big decisions, explaining to the organization why you made the decisions you did, okay, is again critically important because it helps them understand at their level then what decisions they need to make and how they need to make those decisions, okay? And so making decisions is one of the things that I see founder CEOs often struggle with the most because they don't want to give up responsibility for every decision, okay? Because they're used to, when they started, when you're the project manager, you make every decision. There's nobody else to make a decision. But when you transition to the real CEO role, the color on the business cards, the color we're going to paint the wall, those decisions really need to be made at a lower level than the CEO. And you would be amazed at how many companies. I was sitting in a boardroom, I won't name the company, to protect the guilty. I'm sitting in the boardroom of a $1 billion revenue company, and we're having a discussion, and they're talking about a particular area of growth of the business, and I'm like, well, why didn't you grow that faster? Why haven't we, well, it took us 6 months before we realized that the guy running that, before he made a request to the CEO of the company to hire 6 engineers. And I'm like, oh my God, you're running a $1 billion revenue company, and a guy has a way he thinks in his division to grow his business, and he's got to go to the CEO to get permission to hire 6 engineers, and you're wondering why you're not growing? I mean, that was just normal course of business. CEO makes all these decisions. We wouldn't spend money without CEO knowing about it. Really? Okay, that's probably why your revenue's been like this, actually, like that a little bit. Okay. So that's critically important. And then finally, if you put all these 4 pieces together, these almost form the pillars of the ability to deliver performance. And the analogy I use is if you're a football coach, you have to be very clear about what winning is. Head football coach takes those plays, figures out exactly the blocking schemes we're going to use, communication schemes, and every level of the organization breaks it down to their appropriate level. That's exactly what every organization needs to do, and put in the plug here, that's what my company, Chorus, does, is helps companies deliver that written system of record of what everybody's going to do in the organization. And I've made a prediction that within 10 years, this written system of record concept will be common in every company, or at least every well-run company. Just like if you went in a company today and they didn't have a CRM system like Salesforce or something similar, you would think they were run by cavemen. I can remember 15 years ago when nobody had an integrated CRM system. Okay? And Salesforce came out and people went, well, first you'll never get sales guys to give up their contact information, because sales guys at that time typically had it on their local laptop, and it was kind of their security blanket because they owned the contacts and the company didn't. And then second, people said, well, you'll never get companies to put this very important data out in a remote data center. We didn't even call it cloud then, of course. But of course, then about 5 years later, everybody realized that's really stupid to have sales guys owning their own contact information, and this cloud thing might turn out to be something rather interesting, and so this is a better way to do business. And I think there's the exact same opportunity here in the space of a written system of record for what every business does. Okay? So you put all those things together and comes up, you may not be able to read this, but this is one of my favorite quotes, that the better you are as CEO, the less you have to do each day, but the more you can do. Okay? And so as you think about each of these things, these are things that you can be very deliberate and strategic about. And so one of the ways I can tell typically whether a CEO is very good or not is when I go visit with them and just observe their interaction with the company. If they're constantly fighting fires, if they're constantly being interrupted, if there's constantly a problem they have to deal with, that's a good sign that they're not running a very good organization. The best CEOs actually look like they're doing very, very little. And that's where this joke about what does the CEO do, actually the best ones look like they're doing nothing. Okay? But they have tremendous influence in the organization because they've established credibility, competence, and caring, and they know what they need to do, which is always forward-looking. Okay, the best CEO is looking out 6 months, 12 months, as far as he can see, and he's steering the ship to avoid the icebergs. And if he's up there and he's spinning the wheel all the time, he's not a very good CEO. The best CEO plans his turns months in advance. And so it looks like he's not doing a lot, but the ship's just sailing along perfectly smooth in calm waters. And so that's the analogy. And I often use this analogy from horse racing. I'll show you in just a second a slide that kind of captures that. So the challenge for CEOs, and particularly first-time CEOs, is they feel like, hey, I'm the boss now. I'm the CEO. I've got all this responsibility. And then they realize they really don't have a heck of a lot of control. Okay? Because all the really good things that you want to happen, people have to freely give of their will. Okay? You can't get people to be engaged with your company by ordering them to be engaged. You can't get people to be creative by ordering them to be creative. You can't get people to be excited about coming to work and inviting all their friends to work because you tell them to do so. The only way that happens is if you have built up leadership within the organization. So you have this total responsibility, which is, I used to have a full head of hair at one point in time and don't now because of that concept. But I have limited control. And that's the tightrope that all of us as CEOs end up having to walk. And it's tough. I'm not going to tell you it's ever easy, and I had 2 very good successes, but never during that time would I have told you it was easy. There's a great cartoon that says most people think the line of success is up and to the right like this, and instead the cartoon draws the squiggly line that goes all the way up. And it finishes up and to the right. But I can tell you all kinds of horror stories. I can tell you about the day in 2002 when I walked into my company board meeting, looked at my investors and said, guys, it's 2002, the towers have gone down, the economy's in recession. I would go to customers and they would say, Joel, that's the best product I've ever seen from a new company, but if it costs $1, I can't buy it. And so I walked into a September 2002 board meeting. I said, guys, if this was my money, I'd take it and go home. I don't know what to do. I mean, I think we've got a great product. I think I've got a great team. I think I've done, most things right. I've made some mistakes, but I think in general, we're doing the right things. But I can't tell you when anybody's going to be able to buy the product. So if it was my money, I'd take it and go home. I was perfectly prepared for them to go, okay, we're done. Have a nice day. Instead, one of the investors said, we got a checkbook. If you need more money, we're here. I went, okay, going to item 2 on the agenda today. And so the difference between me standing on this stage and me being some working engineer schluck's a guy who had confidence enough to write a bigger check. And he got 10 times his money back, so he still sends me Christmas cards. But okay. So here's the analogy I use for people. It's kind of like you're this jockey. How much control does this jockey have over that horse? Not a lot. That jockey's going wherever that horse takes that jockey, right? But hopefully, if that jockey's done a lot of preparation ahead of time, developed an incredible amount of trust with that beast, he or she in this case, has a lot of influence over that animal. And that animal will do all kinds of amazing things with just a little nudge from that jockey. But sometimes it feels like that, and sometimes it feels like the classic where the horse does the nosedive and you go over the top. And the difference between those two is often not very much. So, another way to look at this job, how should you spend your time as the CEO? What should you really actively do as CEO? Well, the thing that most CEOs do and most founders do is they wear what I call the player hat. They spend all of their time doing jobs within the company. One minute they're the VP of sales and running out to a customer event. One minute they're reviewing the code and checking on the quality. Next minute they're running over and trying to do some banking or finance deal or whatever, okay? That's not what we want to do. As you get bigger and bigger, you should spend less and less time until you're spending almost no time in the player hat. Matter of fact, when I was running NetQOS at the end, we were about a 60 million run rate company with 250 employees. The only time I put on the player hat was each year we would send chocolate candy to all our customers. And at the end, we had, 1,000-something customers. So this was a pretty big exercise. And so I would make a point to go help pack the chocolate candies every Christmas because it was a good time to spend with the team. And that was the only time I spent wearing the player hat at the end of the company. So what should you be doing instead? Number 1 is the coach hat. This is hiring people. This is developing people. Okay, probably the most important role. Again, if I get all the all-stars on my team, I don't have to be very good at much else because they'll figure out, and if I know how to use them, they'll figure out what we need to do. Second thing we need to spend our time is the architect hat. This is part of owning the vision, the strategy. Once every quarter at least, some businesses maybe once every month, I need to sit down for a day and I need to have people work with me to think about the business. Are we in the right markets? Do we have the right products? How can we change things? What are the opportunities? Who might we partner with? All the things about constructing the business from a strategic perspective. And then we've got to operate the business. And so the engineer hat's all about collecting data. One of the first questions I would have, or conversations I would have with a new manager that worked for me is I would say, hey, okay, you're a new manager, you're running marketing, whatever. We need to have a conversation and have agreement on what are the 3 key metrics that's going to tell me whether you're doing a good job or not. And we would have that conversation. And through that conversation, often the combination, we would come up to kind of all kinds of interesting conclusions. One of the first conversations I ever had was with my first director of sales I hired. I said, what's the number 1 metric for sales? Okay. And of course, he was a young hotshot sales guy, and he said, revenue. Of course, that's my job. I sell things. I said, no, that's not a very good metric for sales to me. I said, we could have a great product and it could just fly off the shelves. Would that mean you're a great sales guy? We could have a really crappy product, okay, that had all kinds of problems. Or we could be in a really bad market and you can't sell things. Does that mean you're a bad sales guy? I said, just revenue by itself doesn't tell me a lot about how good a sales guy. I want a metric that represents how good a sales guy you are. And he thought and talked about some things, and basically at the end he said, well, if you're so smart, tell me the answer. Of course, I knew the answer that I wanted him to say. And so I said, well, let me explain the situation to you. We're in enterprise sales. Typical sales cycle is 120 to 150 days. Okay? When we go into a given quarter, therefore, almost every deal that can possibly close that quarter is already in the pipeline. So to me, if you're a really good sales guy running a really good sales process, you will be able to predict the revenue at the end of the quarter in the first 2 weeks of the quarter. So what I want you to do is, after first or second week of the quarter, you've had time to meet with your team, check all the deals, whatever. I want you to give me a number. And I'm going to measure you on how close that number is to the final number at the end of the quarter. That's going to tell me how good a sales guy you are. Okay? That totally changed the way that individual ran sales. Because now, instead of just kind of blindly chasing every deal in a haphazard manner, he sat back and thought about what was necessary to build a predictable process. And by the time we finished in NetQOS, the last 9 out of 10 quarters, he was within 3% of the number 2 weeks into the quarter at the end of the quarter. 9 out of the last 10 quarters. The only quarter he missed was the quarter Lehman failed. Okay, you can't predict that one. Okay, so you get a pass on that one. A lot of people would tell you enterprise software companies can't be within 3% on their sales predictions. We did it 9 out of 10 quarters. Okay, but it was because we were very specific about what the right metric was for measuring sales. So that's just one example of the engineer hat. Learner hat. One of the things I've tried to explain in writing a book about CEOs, I get asked the question, what makes a good CEO? And I'm a scientist type guy, so any theory you have about CEOs, you have to be able to explain kind of the outlier examples. And so a lot of people would tell you, well, you need a lot of experience to be a good CEO, right? You need a lot of knowledge, you need a lot of expertise, you need all this. And then I go, well, wait a minute. Zuckerberg's done okay. His bank account's fairly good. The company's done fairly well. Steve Jobs did okay. He didn't, he was pretty young. Gates, oh, wait a minute, Bill Gates, he dropped out of Harvard, then he became CEO, and he did okay. Where's the thread? Well, the thread is most of those people were so damn smart they dropped out of an Ivy League school because they got bored, okay? If you drop out of an Ivy League school because you're bored, okay, you're pretty smart, and you're a very good learner. And so they were capable of learning fast enough to start from zero in the job of CEO and learn enough along the way to solve the problems without running into an iceberg. And so one of the great traits of all the good CEOs, I'm not that fast a learner, okay? It took me 25 years to get, because I learned a little slower than they did. But I realized along the way I needed to constantly learn. Too many CEOs spend all their time thinking they already have the answers instead of spending a lot of their time trying to learn what potential answers could be. And then finally, the sixth hat is the priest hat. Okay, this is where you worry about how the company feels. It turns out if you study psychology and things, we're not very sophisticated animals. We like to think we're very analytical. My first girlfriend used to call me Mr. Spock. I don't think that was a compliment, actually. But we like to think we make all our decisions on logic and analysis. Turns out we really don't. We really make all our decisions emotionally, and then we use our rational analytical side to justify those answers. We're really not very far removed from the animals that were on the plains of Africa 100,000 years ago trying to worry about what they were going to eat and try and worry about not getting eaten. Okay? And so the morale in your company, how people feel, is critically important. And I use the concept of a priest because I grew up Catholic, put whatever denomination you want in there, but it's the concept of how is the morale of the company, how do people feel? And one of the key roles of the CEO is to act as a shock absorber. and to offset whatever the prevailing morale of the company is. And this is one of the things that makes the job very tough. When everybody in your company is really excited and you've just signed that big deal and everything's going great, that's when you need to come in and go, wait a minute, guys, we hadn't got anywhere yet. We still got to do X, Y, and Z if we want to get to our goal. And you kind of got to bring everybody down. On the other hand, when everybody's depressed because you just lost that customer or the funding didn't come through that you thought, that's when you've got to run in and go, hey, it's okay, guys. Everything's going to be okay. Let me tell you, we got a plan. Here's what we're going to do. Okay? And so you can't really enjoy celebrating with your team when they're celebrating because you have to bring them back. But you also can't, get too depressed because if you get depressed, then it's over. Game's over. I mean, if the coach walks in at halftime and goes, guys, y'all suck. Okay? We're terrible. We're not going to win. I mean, that doesn't work, right? Coach comes in at halftime and goes, okay, we're going to start. We're going to pretend the score is 0-0, and we're going to go from here and see what happens, right? And so that's exactly the role that the CEO has to undertake. So that gives you some idea. Let me spend a couple of minutes. One of the things I do in the book a lot that has all kinds of examples of what I call failure modes as CEO. And I've seen so many of these. There are probably 25 different failure modes as CEO. There are a lot of ways to fail. Here are just some examples. See if you've ever worked for this guy. The firefighter CEO, okay? Sits at his desk all day, waits, tries to hear anything going on in the company, and then rushes in to throw cold water on the fire. Okay, you ever worked for that guy? Okay. No strategic bone in his body. If he has to take action every day or he feels like he's not contributing to the company because he doesn't know what the responsibilities of the job are. Another one I see quite commonly, the super VP CEO. I have a small private equity firm. We own a software company. One of the CEOs for that software company is my former VP of sales that I was telling you about. One day I'm in his office after he had been only CEO for about 6 months, and we're having a conversation. He looks at his watch. He's like, I need to go. And I said, oh, what's going on? He says, the sales meeting's about to start. And I said, oh, so you're going to the sales meeting when it starts, huh? He said, yeah. I said, well, you realize if you go to every sales meeting when it starts, you're the VP of sales. Okay? The guy we hired to be VP of sales isn't the VP of sales if you're at 10 o'clock every day, every Monday when the meeting starts, if you're in there, because what's everybody going to do when any question comes up? They're not going to look at him. You're sitting in the meeting. Okay? If you want to show up at 10:35 and maybe ask a question or see how things are going, okay, you can do that. But if you're in the meeting with the sales team every Monday at 10 o'clock, you're the VP of sales. And he went, oh, I guess you're right. Okay? And then finally, failure mode, the master strategist. Ever work for this guy? He sits in his office, he comes up with a strategy, and then he does nothing. Okay? He doesn't bother to really explain it to anyone. Oh, he might give the talk, right? The 30-minute talk where he gathers everybody together and comes up and tells you, here's the strategy, here's what we're going to do. We're going to grow 100%, we're going to take over the world. And the right guard's sitting there going, Coach, who do I block? I don't understand. But he doesn't care because he's given the strategy. And if people didn't get it, they're just too dumb to work here. Ever worked for that guy? Okay. So there are about 20 other failure modes you can read about in the book if you're welcome. Each one of them has a set of questions to ask yourself. And if you're honest, I think some of you might find interesting results by asking yourself those questions. Okay, so that's what I have prepared today. If you want to find me, I am Joel at chorus.com. Happy to take some questions from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all.
You're welcome. Congratulations.
There are more women in your presentation.
Women in my presentation. Well, there's mostly me in my presentation. The whole question of women CEOs, I've always felt that women would be better as CEOs than men because of a lot of the people aspects that they're typically better. Most of the engineers, sometimes it's just very hard to get them over to the people side. When I graduated as an engineer, I would have told you, 95% of the world could be explained technically and 5% of the world was people issues. And now I would tell you it's exactly the opposite. 95% are people issues and 5% are technical. But but yes, most of the people in.
Just say that, like from a woman's perspective, I love everything you said. It really resonated with me, except that every single picture you used was like of a dude, and this room is full of dudes. And it's like it's awesome because they're all accomplished. You're obviously incredibly accomplished, but
I will change that in the presentation.
sorry, I didn't want to.
My guy in Bangladesh who did the slides, clearly.
No, but I really love the presentation.
Joel, what's the role of advisors? Did you surround yourself with a formal advisory board? Do you have, informal? I meet with guys on Sundays sometimes, and they're the best advisors I've got. So
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the roles of the CEO, again, is to bring kind of external expertise into the company. And so, finding advisors, no one ever gets upset to be asked to advise. I get requests all the time. I may tell you I don't have time. I may tell you I don't know anything about your business, but I'm never upset to get, somebody to ask me to help somebody with their business. And so, I would encourage people to ask, think about who are the most valuable people you could imagine helping you with your business, and go ask. And oftentimes maybe they don't have time, but they know also somebody who you're not aware of that can be particularly valuable. And that's one of the roles of the CEO. Only the CEO can kind of bring in that expert advice. Yes.
Do you think it's maybe time to question that the founder should become the CEO?
I believe that most founders can transition to the CEO role, and they have huge advantages over any CEO you could possibly bring in if they can make the transition, okay? Obviously, they own the vision better than any CEO you're ever going to bring in. They have better understanding of the market than anybody. They understand their culture, what they've built in the organization. There are huge advantages to transitioning the founder to CEO. Now, some don't want to do it. That's one case. Some aren't willing to change their personal issues to do it. If they're a naturally super introverted person, I'm sorry, you're going to have to change a little bit. You're going to have to come do some things that are outside your comfort zone. And if you're not willing to do that, you're probably not going to be as successful. But I think founders can make the transition to CEO if given the right guidance and some sort of methodology, which is what I tried to do in the book. Yes, sir, in the back.
You spoke about the different hats you wear throughout the process. Now, how do you organize those hats on a daily basis? Like, how do you know which ones to choose?
Yeah.
From a large scale, but also if you're first starting off in your small business, maybe you're 5, 10 people or less.
Yeah, so at that point, you're wearing a lot of the player hat. I'm at 21 with Chorus. I still wear some player hat. I was on a sales call today, okay? Not because at this stage, I'm in some cases the only, I'm selling to CEOs and they don't want to meet with my VP of sales, who's a perfectly competent, wonderful woman who could do the job maybe better than I can, but they don't want to meet with her. They want to meet with me because I'm the CEO. So sometimes you're stuck with that. But once you make the transition, then those roles, you try to never wear the player hat if you can. Sometimes somebody quits or whatever and you got to fill in. You're the only guy who can fill in, so you do some of that. The coach hat's probably the most valuable and you spend the most time doing that. The architect and the engineer hat are things you do regularly but not often. Architect, typically most businesses spend a day a quarter, 2 days a quarter thinking about strategy and then kind of set it and go on. Engineer hat, 1 or 2 days a quarter thinking about metrics, thinking about what we're measuring, kind of set it and then, examine it again. Priest hat, I'm wearing all the time. I'm walking around the company. Yeah, the priest and the coach hat are kind of the ones I'm using on a almost constant basis if I'm doing nothing else intentionally, I would say. Yes, sir.
What happens when you build a company with a partner?
Yeah.
And with two different points of view,
Yeah.
but the company is successful?
Try doing it with your wife who's smarter than you.
Yeah, but both each other can be a CEO. So
Yeah.
what happened in the stage of the company?
Yeah,
Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I've seen it. There is a group in town, there's a buddy of mine in town, close friend of mine, who's done very well with he and another gentleman being co-CEOs. I don't get it, okay? I don't think it works. Okay, in my wife and I's case, it was very simple. She was the technical brains. Anything that was technical was hers. Everything else was mine. It was clear delineation of roles. Everyone in the organization knew who to go to. No problem. But I'm a big fan. Somebody's got to be in charge, and the dual thing I don't think works very often. I would not, for instance, I would not fund a company that said we're going to have two guys and they're going to be CEO, or two people, whatever. Yes, sir.
So when you're starting a company, you said very often it's groups of friends, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's like mine started with 2 or 3 people know each other at age 21, and it's been suggested, and one of them is my wife, okay? So
Yeah.
it's been suggested we do some scenario planning. The company might reach a stage where people who are in the senior positions now are maybe no longer the right fit, or maybe it's no longer their interest. So, like, do I have to sit down with my wife and say, if we get divorced, this is how we treat the company back to her? What should we do?
Yeah, I mean, any lack of clarity in the organization around who's in charge and how it works is a problem. Every situation's different, so you got to kind of handle yours on your own. But that lack of clarity I've seen kill companies where people are not sure who's really in charge. Maybe you got a CEO, but really somebody else is kind of the one that everybody knows is in charge. That doesn't work very well. Yeah.
Hi, I was just really interested in what you were saying about outlier CEOs. And I was thinking, I've heard people say, oh, Mark Zuckerberg, he was just a management prodigy, to explain it. But you could think about like Steve Jobs, he took a big break from where he started to where he ended up. Or just maybe it isn't so much that they're a prodigy or whatever, but that they had more leeway to do they would not be a good priest, not be a good coach, because of the environment that they're working in, like this tech environment that's very, for lack of a better word, like an Asperger's place where some people are kind of and that's just like for a shout out to women and to say that I think we're going to be okay and it's going to get better as we go. You're my best friend from high school. I haven't seen her yet, and she's right back there. Yay! We've been friends since we were 14, and here we are together, randomly in the CEO founder phase. It's going to be okay. Ladies,
So, one of the things I'll point out in the CEO role, they talk about horses for courses in horse racing. There are CEOs for different types of businesses. I don't want to go. I can't go run a retail, probably any retail business. That's not me. Okay, I'm a business-to-business guy, and so different CEOs. Obviously, if it's a technical business, you're likely to have a more technical CEO. If it's a different type of business, so there are horses for courses. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
I was wondering the topic you posed about how much time you spend wearing each of the different hats. You talked about the hat, but not quite like the percentage time you spend wearing that hat, and then also which of those roles is good to do, like in a group meeting versus one-on-one. Like, do you usually have? I mean, just like some tactical advice. Do you usually have like a weekly team meeting with your reports, and then a one-on-one meeting with them, and that's where you usually do your coaching, or
Yeah,
more in a group versus one-on-one?
there's certainly a rhythm that every company gets in, but it changes over time. When you're 20 people and everybody can fit in a room, I'll bring everybody in a room. When it's 200 people, suddenly there's a whole different thing. I mean, typically there's a weekly meeting rhythm, a quarterly meeting rhythm, and then an annual planning rhythm. But within that, how that happens and stuff can dramatically depend on size of the company and distribution of the people in the company.
So you mentioned it's very difficult for those to understand the roles and responsibilities of being a CEO unless they did one.
Yeah.
What's the best way to really convey that to those to better understand that and make the role of the CEO a little bit easier in your day-to-day operation?
Yeah, so, one thing the military does, the military has if you're like a ship, you have a commanding officer and you have an executive officer, and every other person reports through the executive officer. So it's really a junior CEO in training, okay? And so one of the things American companies haven't done near enough of, to me, is put in that role of a president, COO, second in command, somebody clearly that's kind of involved that can get training for the CEO job, and you can see how they're going to react and everything. A lot of people say, in the bigger companies, they'll let somebody go run a division or something, but that's not the same, as being CEO. There are a whole bunch of decisions you don't get to make in that job that you do get to make that you have to make in the CEO role. So I'm a big fan of having somebody that kind of serves in a COO president role to kind of see what's going on in the organization.